I can touch up and post, by the way, as well. Like I can actually put makeup on you and like drag makeup if you want.
Because I was out cycling today. I don't know what's going on with me.
Cycling? What's happening?
Motivation season's coming up, and I'm trying to get fit. And so the only way I kind of force myself to do that is sign up for a couple of 140-kilometer races in March and in May. The problem is I find cycling incredibly boring, so
Hmm.
it's a real trial for me.
Well, welcome to the show, Colin. How are you?
I'm very good. How are you?
So last time we chatted, we are in Melbourne actually, which was interesting. You were on one of your tours and had a good chat at a what was it like a cafe slash wine bar slash something at a very historic building in Melbourne. It was fun.
Part of the Colin Lewis World Tour. I was back in Melbourne, where actually when I moved to Australia all those years ago, it is one of my favorite places in the world, and so it was really fantastic to meet face to face and meet somebody who you see online, and then you meet them in person, and they're really lovely, and it was great. It was good fun. And in fact, that trip met after I met Ian Pritchard as well, who also lives in Melbourne, and so it's lots of fun. One of the benefits of doing what I do is I get to meet nice people around the world who I've only met on Twitter.
It's different, isn't it? Sometimes people's personalities on that are forced to say certain things on social media are very different to the actual person. Other times it's not.
Yeah, I'd like to point out I'm a complete asshole in person, but very nice on Twitter.
Maybe for me it's a bit of a reverse. I do remember having an interesting discussion around, like, obviously you do a lot of work in retail media, right? That's kind of what you're known for now, correct?
Well, it's one of the things I do. I actually do three things. I work with startups, do a lot of kind of go to market and positioning for startups, which is really a lot of fun. The second thing I do is work with brands and retailers on digital commerce with a specialization in retail media. And the third thing I do is I do a lot of sort of workshops and training, as in, people bring me in to do all day workshops and stuff like that. So that's kind of partly why I was kind of doing a few world tours over the last year or two, because I get brought in to talk about things like marketing effectiveness, digital commerce, retail media, and so on. And it's because my own background has been as a CMO for marketing director for years and years, for 25 years or so in Australia and in the UK and in to a certain extent in my home territory in Ireland, but also, of course, in Asia as well.
And I think that's kind of why I wanted to talk to you, because probably the breadth and depth of your experience in this area, provides a different, I don't know, I would say a more robust discussion, a bit more richness around certain sort of nuanced areas that we want to talk about today. So if someone was saying retail media, what exactly does that mean?
Well, as I guess we need to explain the context. What's happening at the moment in the world is that you probably heard that cookies have been deprecated, and so that kind of causes a lot of problems around the whole digital advertising network being less reliable, less robust than it was before in terms of its capabilities. Secondly, retailers have had, particularly since the pandemic, have been able to develop their e-commerce capabilities, and now in some respects they're up to 10-20% of their total revenues. And on third aspect of that is that there's been a lot of new technologies. In fact, some of it coming out of Australia, where you are, that enables retailers to monetize their traffic. And very quickly around 2020, when I was talking to a few brands and a few retailers around this, I recognized that it isn't actually just some sort of new thing around what retailers can do as a shakedown for another version of trade marketing. In fact, it was going to cause a complete change in how people think about marketing and how people think about how we develop brands and how people think about distribution, and actually in terms of how teams are structured and how leadership is structured within marketing teams as well. And that's actually I sound like Madame Zelda looking into her crystal ball, but that actually all of this has panned out over the last while. And in many respects, people were looking at the success of what Amazon advertising did. But in fact, that was kind of like an indicator rather than the key thing that people could do. It was just a kind of a metaphor of the challenge that was coming down the track.
It's interesting because one thing I found with some discussions, depending on who you talk to, is this polarization of brand advertising versus more targeted advertising, sometimes labeled as performance. And I feel sometimes people put this retail media into more of that performance category, maybe because of the legacy thoughts around it being a catalog inside a larger retailer and insertion inside, some sort of like more sales orientated environment closer to the point of sale and perhaps something that's building memories in the background. But what are your thoughts on like categorizing this? Is this a brand or performance thing?
I don't really have, because of my background, I don't really have this sort of divide in my mind. And I suppose I should explain the context for this. Back in the day, when I started out my career, I literally delivered jams and marmalades. That was my very first job. I had a blue van. I had to go and deliver jams and marmalades because the company I worked for had bought this company that, guess what, made jams and marmalades. And they said, Colin, find out what we did. So I've always been the sort of person who was kind of very, if you will, commercial, actually out and about doing stuff with my hands. And then a couple of years later, when I became head of marketing in a business that was all retail, I kind of always saw myself as very much a sort of commercial person who's like about driving revenues, about driving results. And so I don't really see any divide between this idea of brand and performance marketing, because ultimately, as a marketing director, your sole responsibility is to drive results. That's what you're there for. And you have to pull any levers that you can. And these kind of rules and kind of our pseudo rules, if you will, around brand and performance are essentially making up things for people who are, ultimately, I would go and argue, are looking for status.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting thing around status because we were talking about this as well. And I think that's probably one of the worst things about social media as well, as this sort of like, I don't know, this competition to create this sort of status game and then post about it and get awards and whatever. But you said here you can't not have status. It's an unconscious obsession that drives the best and worst of us. I mean, do you have an interesting story around this search for status? Because I mean, I've been trying to write about this as one of the main hallmarks of a brand campaign, which is why they tend to be quite popular at larger companies, especially in the corporate scene, who may be a bit less bottom line orientated. It tends to go there very quickly. Do you have any interesting examples? Or
Let he is without sin cast the first stone. I've spent a lot on what would be is called the trade brand campaigns, and probably maybe 50 million over my career on TV across numerous markets. And spent, I think at one stage, I spent 800 grand in 2 weeks on production for one particular TV campaign. And, run some of the most famous brands, particularly in the UK, and to a certain extent in Ireland and even Australia. And so I'm kind of like agnostic on the whole thing, though, because the key thing is like, are we here to drive results? And, I'm sure we'll talk about it later, but the more senior you get in your career, that essentially is the only thing that matters. So personally, I don't see, as I said earlier, between kind of brand and performance, I don't really see the world like that. However, what I do see is a lot of talk on social media around these things. And I also see a lot of things around where if somebody says, well, it's not kind of really like that once in a row, but there's a lot of shutting down of those particular arguments. And I would argue that many of these particular things are around what I call status, because as you touched on there, you cannot not have status. We are all playing status games. Being on a podcast like this is essentially playing a status game. And you know what? That's okay. I don't have a problem with that whatsoever. Because that's actually how we move on in the world. That's how we structure our lives. Everything is a status game. And that's okay. However, when it doesn't become okay is when we actually go and claim status and then say that's actually the best way to do things. And I'm reminded of my conversation with a guy I do a lot of work with, and he's the ex-CEO of one of the largest agencies in the UK, or in fact, one of the largest agencies in the world, but he was a chief exec in the UK. And he would say, now he's saying it a tad more colloquially than what I'm about to say, but he said, within the building at the top with the best offices, with the coolest layout and the best haircuts, and would be the guys working in the creative department, and then maybe the strategy guys below them, and then somewhere in there was maybe the planning folks, but in the basement, in the windowless, airless rooms, was the guys running AdWords, and maybe just slightly above them in the kind of status game was the direct mail folks. But other than that, that was it, you know? And that kind of thing just kind of struck a chord with me, whereby people talk about these things, but actually what they ultimately are is essentially, in some respects, a status game, because there's actually no reason why you should say that running a TV campaign is better than running an AdWords campaign. There is no there's no real difference between the both forms of advertising, the both media being bought, and everything else is just, discussion at the edge.
I was just talking about media strategy or creating a little meme on Twitter yesterday, which is caught on, which is pretty funny. It's that wine meme that's been going around. Someone getting served this wine and he's sort of like sniffing it and sipping it and enjoying it, and the waiter. Anyway, I just sort of just did this thing around, that being presented this blended media plan, I, the wine bottle, and then this person that has no idea about wine pretending it's really good. And what I've found with a lot of media campaigns is they, sprinkle in little elements and then sort of wrap a story around it. It's diversified, and then sort of on sell it to someone who maybe isn't very discerning about how these things actually work. And I think, is this sort of status game, or maybe clients buying into these different media based on status rather than anything else? Is that sort of distorting and creating some of these problems that maybe are showing themselves
Well,
up? Or?
yes and no. I mean, we have to look into what it's like to be a senior marketing person or a marketing person buying this media.
Mm.
And I think this is the bit I really want to kind of dive into for a lot of people. And in fact, if there's any advertising people listening to this podcast, I want to really, or people who obsessed about brand and brand development, I think we should really look into the real world of what it's like to be a marketing director. In fact, can I take a sidebar here and go and say, when I'm looking on uh, not just social media, but when I'm looking for sort of guidance and thinking and ideas, who do I really look for? Okay, and I actually look for people, sort of a hierarchy, if you will. And, not necessarily at the top of that hierarchy. People who I look very closely at are people who've been marketing directors or CMOs or whatever, because they kind of get it, because they've had their feet held to the fire or their ass on the line, whatever particular bodily metaphor you choose to use. And I kind of listen to them a lot more, even if they just only ever worked in one industry, but they kind of get it. Okay. The second set of person I listen to is people who've maybe developed, could be an e-commerce business or a business from scratch and then maybe sold it, whatever. Yeah, sure, there's a little bit of halo effect and what have you, but it's kind of, at least they kind of seen what's worked and they kind of are not, that they've had skin in the game. After that, much further down, I listen to people who are advisors who've done that role before. Then below that are people who, and much further below that are people who work, and below sounds like a status thing again, but people who've worked in, ad agencies and all the rest, because their advice is impeccable. They really know their stuff inside out, and they bring an incredibly different, rich view that I may not have. But the reality is, it's only a small part of what we do. And so to go and say that the answers only come from an ad agency or strategy, or worst word of all, that it's all about creative, that's just not how it's kind of working. And, just teasing that out a little bit more, one particular, well, most roles I have as a marketing director, they start off with, you wake up in the morning, you go into the office, you open up the laptop, and there is the sales either from the previous day or the previous week, because the businesses I work with, the numbers come in and you can tell. Yeah. And one particular business, not only did the sales come in every hour, they also came in as a text every hour, 24 hours, 360 days a year. And so you knew exactly what you were doing, whether it worked or not. And so you can, people listening to this can maybe say, well, Colin's kind of like got a bad perspective on the world, or the wrong perspective on the world, because he's always had the numbers come in. Yeah, that's kind of like, that's it. So that's why I'm pretty hard ass on this whole idea of, because first of all, the numbers will come in, and then you'd go and say, what's causing the problems with these numbers? If they're good or if they're great, you can go and say, thank God for that. And then you have to look through a litany of things that you could do to address that. And one small item on that might be the advertising. One small item on that. But there's a whole set of other things that you can think about. which include distribution, which include the fact that the sales guy's been asleep for a couple of months, which include the fact that nobody can find the products in store, which include a whole host of other things, which include maybe you didn't hire the right person, which includes the fact that somebody's not there in the office and you're like, didn't get the email sent out. So there's a whole rake of things. But if you look at what happens on social media, you would think it's all advertising, it's all creative. And with a marketing director's hat on, it's a much smaller percentage. In fact, less than 10%, arguably 5%. And that's in a big company doing big stuff. In all other companies, it's much smaller.
This came up last week. Let's just say you're a company and you're doing this advertising, and every year the sales is going down, and you do this for 10 or 20 years. Would you call that advertising effort effective or not?
I have specific experience of this because I worked for a company about 10 years ago they were involved in what's called the directory inquiries business, which in the UK, and in fact in the 5 countries I was the marketing director for, were incredibly well-known business. As in, if I mentioned the business, everybody would sing the song that we had on the ad. So I think you had the Yellow Pages in Australia, same kind of thing. These businesses are businesses that were ultimately on the way down. And what was our role in those businesses? Our role was to stop the rot, not necessarily make things go up, or to stop the rot, because nothing else could be done because the market was changing and so on. I actually got a bonus for stopping the rot in one of the markets. In the other market, I couldn't stop the rot. And so this is why I come back to what's the context. You can't really go and say, John did a terrible job in X. In my case, I actually got a bonus because I stopped the rot, as I say, in one market. But in other markets, we couldn't. And eventually, they got tired of listening to me saying, there's only so much rot we can stop here, but the market is against us. And they brought another person who said, no, you can actually change the world and you can change consumer sentiment. So I think the campaign you're talking about is the Australian lamb campaign, from what I can recollect by looking on social media. Or was it the got milk one? I can't remember. It doesn't matter. There are certain markets where essentially holding the line is actually a success.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like you said, the context, and also you're unaware of the political environment as well, I think, looking from afar. So in these conversations, like you said, that could be your MO to, to stave off the pending doom in your market for as long as possible. I know the TV market in Australia, like media sales, did that, hiring influencers and things like that, because they just knew the viewership was declining. So they wanted to maintain the sort of high price of the media, and did a pretty interesting campaign around there. So it is interesting. And like with that said, do you think that diversity of the media mix sort of plays into that as well? Like which mediums you use more than others during different times, or?
Well, part of the thing I kind of always kind of scratch my head with is this kind of notion of like broad reach. In fact, I'll take a step back. We're all very familiar with these ideas of the laws of marketing effectiveness and so on, which are really fantastic, and they codified a lot of the things that senior marketers would have kind of had in the back of their mind, but couldn't kind of quite put their finger on once they had a couple of years' experience. And they've been really just excellent in terms of getting everybody to knuckle down and see the world through a different lens. I think the problem has been, or the challenge has been really, is that many people take these as like the sort of the Libro d'Oro, as they would have in Venice back in the day, like the only way, the only things you can choose from, and nothing else matters. And of course, the world isn't like that. The world is kind of messy, and incentives are different, and so on. But one of the kind of biggest kind of problems on this is this idea of broad reach. And it's the one where I hear people talk about broad reach, and I just kind of scratch my head and go, broad reach media, what are you talking about? Because then it turns into this sort of slightly bizarre world of codifying only one particular thing as being broad reach, which essentially is TV. And I'm like, right, okay, let me just kind of deconstruct that a bit more. Okay. So if I'm talking broad reach, let me talk about the most broad reach media in the goddamn world, and it's Google and Facebook. because they're the largest platforms in the world and they literally reach everybody. So is that not broad reach? No. That's not, Colin, you got it wrong. That's actually performance marketing. That's not broad reach. Okay. So what is broad reach? Oh no, it's TV is broad reach. Right. Okay. So TV is broad reach. Now let me just look. What are we really talking about here? What are we optimizing for? What are you really referring to? Because I can name off the top of my head, I don't know, 10, 20 brands who've never been on television who are incredibly successful. I can name plenty of companies in direct-to-consumer e-commerce, which if you were the owner of those businesses and you took 10 or 20 million out of them, you would regard that as a success. Yeah. What is your definition of success? What are we talking about here? Let's get into the details. So as somebody who has bought TV and media in probably 10 countries, I kind of know a little bit about it, and I've spent a lot of time kind of spending both my own money, because I've invested in companies where we've used our own money, and also actually other people's money when the companies I work for. And the one thing I can categorically state by a long shot is TV advertising is incredibly expensive, because it's incredibly expensive because to get the reach you need is causes a number of things that happen 3 to 6 months earlier. I've got to create a TV campaign. So to create a TV campaign that is of adequate quality, I can't go shoot it on my iPhone. I need professional editors. I need professional creative. I need to go to an agency. And that's not the work of 10 grand. That's the work of typically 6 figures. Okay, and then we start buying. Well, then if you say I want to buy OnePlus and I want to reach this audience, which in the UK, if you want to buy OnePlus all adults, and you want to kind of span it out, it's on ITV, plus you got to do all these other stations. Now you're into the hundreds of thousands. Now let's look at Australia, another place where I bought TV. If I buy TV, I can't buy a national buy. I've got to buy in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, and Perth. And then I've actually got to buy the country equivalent TV channels as well. And I also might maybe have to edit my ad to make it work for those local markets. And suddenly I am into cost through the roof just to get these broad reach. Now, this is before I start talking about things like the advent of TikTok and so on. Now, it turns out that in my home country, Ireland, broad reach is actually a great statement to make. Yeah, because there's actually one TV channel that matters in terms of coverage and one radio program that matters in terms of coverage. In fact, there's one TV program that if you bought a TV ad on that and a radio ad on that, you kind of cover 10 to 20% of the population. But that will cost you, a lot of money, like a lot of money. So when people say broad reach, I'm like, what context? Because TikTok, Facebook, and YouTube and Google are all broad reach. But buying on TV today, it ain't broad reach anymore because they're all on these other channels. And so it's become this kind of cult-like behavior where we say broad reach. And reality is the people who we want to talk to who are doing things are not on these purportedly broad reach channels. In fact, I was talking to Karen Nelson-Field about this the other day, and I was going, Karen, maybe I'm naive, maybe I'm just like an idiot, and I'm missing something in the world. And she said, no. One of the kind of thinking, the sort of misleading thinking about broad reach is that it's got a lack of understanding of the plumbing of the advertising world today, and particularly the plumbing of the digital advertising world, which, by the way, it does show up in these bizarre kind of like contexts. So Tom Roach, who's one of the sharpest brains, one of the smartest people, and an incredible gent when you meet him as well, has to write an article in Marketing Week going that, digital advertising can build brands. And you're like, wow, the fact that Tom has to write this sort of thing shows how bizarre the discussion has become. Yep. But back to my point with Karen. And Karen was saying, it's people don't understand the plumbing in the background of the digital advertising world. They don't understand what the likes of the Trade Desk do. They don't understand what's really going on behind the scenes. just one of these kind of weird things. It's a challenge now, just like me trying to get the microphone working for you, or working with us earlier. You've got to actually understand the technology before you can make these broad statements about what works and what doesn't work, particularly in 2024.
It's interesting. I did hear that discussion. Like, you can't build a brand with digital and digital to digital. Every time I speak to someone who says that, I 100% of the time they've never ever used Google Ads, Facebook, Business Manager ever. I can guarantee you. And if you ask them a very basic question about that, they won't be able to answer you. I think maybe some of that conjecture comes from when they've worked for very large brands and there's been a digital buy, but that digital buy has been like programmatic display, and then obviously they've just bought probably junk inventory, and they've seen no uplift because they've bought poorly from the beginning, and then that sort of gets a bad rap maybe because it's been bought badly. Like you said, they don't understand maybe the ways of avoiding some of the cheaper inventory.
You know what? Back to let he's with its in first zone. 10 years ago, I used to always have a laugh at myself. I would do what I call get religion. I would go, no, now we're gonna buy digital display. This is what we're gonna do. And I'd buy it across. Maybe I'd be buying newspaper, or I'd be buying radio, or I'd be buying Facebook, whatever the case is, and then or AdWords, and then I'd say, no, we'll do digital display now. And then a couple of months later, I'd be like, no, I'm so wrong. What am I? And the reason I was being an idiot was because I was assuming digital display was actually going to actually drive results straight away. We needed direct response campaigns, and it didn't. And I was asking it to do the wrong thing, and I wasn't in the market. And also at the time, the buys weren't as good, and a lot of the programmatic stuff wasn't as strong as it could be. So to be honest with you, I think it's kind of like a lot of us are. We don't have I think the phrase, if I correctly phrase it, is epistemic humility, which is that we go and say, we don't go and look at what we do and what we choose to do with some level of humility based on the fact that we think we may or may not be wrong, but this is our best guess. And one of the things I encourage people to go and say is, like, if you believe you're right all the time, well, and you make these black and white statements all the time, like, I really don't believe you, because I can point out 10 instances, right now, where I go and say, well, that's actually wrong. So let's just take, say, my friend Weimer Schneiders, who we have lots of discussions around marketing effectiveness, and he's a fantastic person. He's got this incredible metaphor around the banana and so on, and which is like to explain how you need to develop new customers, new customer acquisition, particularly through the longer tail and so on. But I've actually been working with a mattress company who are a family-owned business who turn over close to, what's the number? Close to about 8 figures. So it's a family-run business.
Wow.
Been around for 40 years. And really good on innovation. Just spent a lot of money on a factory upgrade, and I was kind of reluctant to deal with them because I'm like, I always tricky to deal with owner operators, but they're really fantastic people. And I told them to focus actually on their top 5 customers. Now, because their customers are the channel, and the top 5 retailers control 97% of the market. And for me not to do that and to say to focus on the remaining, well, let's call it 5%, would be detrimental to their business. And so they've only focused on that for the first couple of months. And now because of the kind of strength and kind of confidence they've got from kind of rebuilding those relationships, and kind of, they've now actually gone and said, okay, now I can maybe go elsewhere and so on. And, as Weimer will know, I mean, making these things completely black and white statements, which is where we started out, is detrimental to our professional, detrimental where we are. I broke the rule of the banana, which is like, go for the long and, go focus on customer acquisition. But the context was, if they had done that, they would go bankrupt. If they do a brand broad reach campaign, they will go bankrupt. And so this is kind of, back to that point. The stuff that's in the likes of, say, How Brands Grow and whatever, all these books that we should read and really study, it's not directly applicable to, say, fast growth technology companies. You know, maybe the issue around creating assets and so on is distinctive assets. But in every startup, because I said at the start, I deal with startups. What's the one thing I spend all the time with? Focus on positioning. Focus on positioning. And in fact, tomorrow afternoon, I've got to deliver something for somebody, and she's going, my positioning is unclear. And when I talk to people, they don't understand what I do. So in the software business, you've got to have positioning because you're dealing with an abstraction. Yeah. It's not like dealing with a thing that I can touch and feel in my hands. Yeah. So that's why when I hear rules, I'm like, well, I can think of 10 reasons when that's not directly relevant and they're actually misleading, and you'll make the company go bankrupt.
I think there was another famous guy, Jason Lemkin from SaaStr, and a few other people. They were having a discussion around, and Sam Altman as well. Okay, speaking of brands that have built themselves digitally using no other channels, ChatGPT is one of them. But he was saying, the key to a lot of startup growth is to go after a very niche, smaller portion of the market, service them really well, and then expand out from there. You never go broad at the beginning because there's just too much risk involved in that. So the path to successful startups is to start small with very defined reach and a very defined sort of set of customers, similar to your mattress example.
Well, we've noticed for 40, 50 years, because Geoffrey Moore has written the book called Crossing the Chasm. If you work in any form of software, in fact, if you worked outside of software, but you really should be studying the original, the Bible of software development. In fact, there's obviously Awesome by April Dunford, and there's Geoffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm. If you can know those two businesses, then you can really understand the world in a completely different way. There's a couple of things in Crossing the Chasm where it's so clear, where when you read it, you go, well, this kind of completely is not what I'm reading when I read all this stuff around marketing effectiveness. Well, of course, the reason is it's a different industry and the context is different and the reality is different. So back to this point, not everything is identical. For fast-moving consumer good brands in mature markets with mass distribution, you should be applying that as much as possible. And even that is a bit arguable for reasons I'll explain later. But in all other contexts, you've got to narrow down your target. If you read what's happening elsewhere, people talk about targeting as bad. I'm like, what? What are you talking about? Nobody has unlimited resources.
I know.
Nobody has unlimited time. But you've got to target. You must target. You've got to position. If you don't believe that, I would suggest you go and take your own money out of the bank and set up your own business and see how you go. Because then you'll learn pretty quickly that I got a target. Now, the reason why the targeting thing is quite interesting is essentially everything that we deal with in the world, particularly new innovative technologies, they all started by targeting, and they all started by targeting early adopters. And, the one that everybody talks about, there's two brands that everybody talks about as kind of models for us all to follow. One is Apple, one is Tesla. Guess what they did? They started out targeting a very small target of the market, which was in the case of the original Apple thing, which is these kind of hackers who like kind of put stuff together, because the guys were pretty much selling it out of the back of their cars, more or less, or the back of their garage, I should say. Same thing as Hewlett Packard. And the original Tesla was a Lotus, because as everybody knows, I'm a complete car nutcase. And they took a Lotus Elise body and put a battery in it and could do 100 kilometers. And they were targeting it to very early adopters who like to kind of show off and have cars and didn't mind that the car didn't really work. That's how all new technologies work. You start with a little kind of target market who don't care if the thing works. What we are talking about and what we hear on social media is actually about mature businesses where the growth factors are in plus or 1 or 2%. We're talking about a completely different world when it comes to technology.
And do you think we're sort of coming back to the 4 Ps here as well? I don't know if anyone's listening, but marketing used to be 4 Ps. There's a section where the promotional P sometimes, and advertising within that gets an disproportionate amount of attention and discourse, I think. But for me, getting that mix of the product, the positioning of that product in the market, the right target market after doing an analysis, all that kind of thing. Like just that nuance of that, it's you've got this complex system of variables that you're sort of like tweaking and trying to figure out like a little formula that works, and then you get it to work for one target market, and then you have to adapt it for the next, expansion into a bit of a larger market, and that process from start to finish, it gets very complex and very messy, and like the advertiser is just one little sort of layer of the back end of maybe that more core process. So.
I've had a definite backlash myself on social media when I go and say creativity is not relevant to a marketing director's role. And it's like as though I've said, I've kind of robbed your firstborn and, run off in a car with them or something, obscene like that. Because it's not really that relevant. If it was that relevant, we'd be sitting around, thinking up creative things. You don't really. In fact, with the advent of digital advertising, you can actually be more creative. And that's actually why it's but reality is the marketing director role is about 2 or 3 bits. One is it's about knowing the numbers, particularly in my case, the roles I had, the numbers appeared, as I said earlier, every morning or every hour. So you have to know your numbers and structure it. So the second thing about what it's a marketing director role is it's about, obviously people management, particularly if you've got a team, which would take up maybe 10, 20% of your time. And then maybe the other 30, 40% of your time would be about managing upward. And that really is the art of persuasion. And that managing upwards and actually crosswards, you might be dealing with store managers, you might be dealing with operations managers, you might be dealing with manufacturing managers. And your role is about managing people upwards, crossways, and aside, and understanding people dynamics, understanding status, understanding what you can say, what you can't say. And actually that then changes if it's an owner-operated business, a family-run business, an entrepreneurial business, a fast growth business, a quoted business, a non-quoted. All of those dynamics completely changed. Somewhere in your day, maybe at 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, between 3 and 3:05, you might get to be creative. That's it. Yeah. Other than that, you are kind of doing a role of all senior managers. In fact, one of the things that happens, John, is people come to me and say, will you act as a coach to me? And I don't advertise it. I don't have a broad reach TV campaign about my coaching facilities, but a lot of people come to me and ask me about it. And what I actually teach them is, I'm assuming they know the technical aspects of the job, but I actually go and say straight up, it kind of doesn't matter if you don't know the technical aspects of the job. Like, you don't have to be the best accountant to be the CFO. You don't have to be the best people manager to be the CEO. What you do know have to do is understand corporate dynamics, understand incentives, understand people, and understand how to manage upwards. In other words, you've got to understand politics. You've got to be the marketing Machiavelli. And if you don't do any of those, no amount of knowing any technical aspect of marketing will get you anywhere. In fact, it will be completely irrelevant.
And this is the thing that I talk about as well. These people talk about being more correct on this, and I'm like, well, politics and like, just the day-to-day management of the messiness of the operations is like 90-something% of your job. So like, I'd be talking about a bit more about that than anything else to start with. But
the way I frame it for you is there's a massive difference between marketing effectiveness and being an effective marketer. You can be an effective marketer without knowing anything about marketing effectiveness. And the proof point is How Brands Grow was created as a book in 2011, and Les Binet and Peter Field started writing about it in 2006 and 2007. And think about the many millions of brands that were created prior to those that never had that. So it's not an absolute necessity for success. And indeed, probably the best marketer I know, like in my career, of the hundreds and hundreds of people, was a particular gentleman I know in Ireland, and he's done it in 3 different industries, including B2B, including global firms, including firms that every single person on this call will know. But when I listen to him, I'm like, he doesn't care about channels. He doesn't care about media. He doesn't care about anything like that. He sees himself as a change maker in an organization. And essentially, the role of a senior marketer is to bring a company from here to here. That's the role, from here to here. It's not about media. It's not about creative. It's barely even about people management in the sense of like how I manage a team. It's about understanding people and bringing people from here to here. In fact, my last full-time CMO role, I worked very closely with the CEO on our big change management program. We did two things. We did email and we did events. And the rest of my time was spent, how do we change the ethos of the organization? How do we change the thinking around the organization to be more innovative? And what programs can we do to go and do that? And we increased our revenue from 16.7 million in 2016 to 29.4 million in 2019 with no changes other than the ones I just mentioned there.
So no emotional 60-second television commercial popped in there? That wasn't the key to growth?
Well, it was B2B business. And, just to clarify that a bit more, all we did was target. We only did, if we did anything, in fact, we didn't even do Google AdWords. We only did pure email. And I made sure the database went up to about 4,200 people. In fact, which leads me just as a kind of a minor rant here. I did say somebody on social media today whinging on about email. And I kind of see it as a sort of email as a sort of a sign. If I'm talking to you, John, and you say email doesn't work, I think I see that as a sign that you're a completely clueless marketer and who doesn't understand anything. Yeah. And I see this all the time. Email doesn't work. AdWords doesn't work. Amazon advertising doesn't work. I'm like, okay, cool. I'm dealing with a person who doesn't understand anything about the world whatsoever.
Yeah, or that channel's dead. I'm like, channels generally don't are live one day and then dead the next day just because someone says it. I'm like, someone may decline, slowly over time and lose audience, but they never die.
Well, again, it's all context dependent. If you are on radio here in Ireland, you can really you can deliver reach at a very cost effective level, very low level, and you will get sales tomorrow because radio in Ireland is both national and super local. But radio is not the same, say, for instance, in the UK. It just doesn't deliver the same way. But radio in Australia can actually deliver for you. Having bought radio, and radio in New Zealand can do the same thing as well. And so again, it's all really dependent. It's really super dependent. This is why I cannot understand when people start talking about these as these massive rules, because it's not the same. Like, say for instance, you asked me earlier about retail media, and you go, well, Colin, retail media, you will never hear me say the following: retail media is the greatest thing since sliced bread. Everybody should do it, and it works in every market. I never ever say that. I never say that at all. Yeah. And here's an example. So why doesn't it work in Italy, or why doesn't it work in Ireland? Yeah. Or why doesn't it work as well, say, in Australia? Well, it's pretty easy to work out. In Italy, grocery is mostly done in person because people, as they will tell you, they want to see the produce. And so very little of the supermarket chains or grocery chains in Italy actually sell stuff online because the local person is like, yeah, they got their fancy phones, they go to out, but they want to see the product. So it doesn't work quite as well there. Why does it not work in Ireland? Well, because there are no retail media chains large enough. It just hasn't happened. Yeah. Why does it not work in Australia as well? Well, because there's no Amazon. Yeah, they just opened up the new facility outside of Melbourne in Pakenham. And so it's the first time I've actually had a warehouse. And so the concept of Amazon advertising in Australia means absolutely nothing. Yeah. And there's only two grocery chains that kind of really matter. And everybody knows those. So again, even I, who earn a little bit of a living and I've got incentivized to come make outrageous claims, I don't, because everything is context dependent within a market. And even say like a mega market like Germany, you can't make these massive claims. It just doesn't work like that. So what I would say to your listeners is never listen to anybody who makes one size fits all statements. Never listen to anybody who says this will work and so on. It's just, the world isn't like that.
we talk about annoying creatives. I found one of the easiest ways to annoy them is to point out that you can build a brand not using an emotional 30 or 60 or 90-second television commercial. Like you can use rational arguments. So you can put that video on YouTube instead of TV. And I had this question actually at Essex South by Southwest just last year out of the audience, and so I sent them a piece from Ken Roberts, who has some really good, interesting papers on this and has written quite extensively about it. But where did the history of TV sort of ads come from in this sort of 90 or 60 or 30-second format? Because I think, it still dominates a lot of campaigns today. We see even the lamb ad that we were talking about before, like it's a central piece. It's like a 3-minute spot. And other sort of large advertising campaigns are generally formed around this like core 60, 90-second television commercial, even to this day. Where did this come from?
One thing I would say to your listeners is it's always good to delve into the history of the thing that you're doing. I've been lucky enough to work with some incredible industries. I've worked in boring stuff like telco, but also travel, airlines, music, and technology. And if you go back into the history of what they do, you can actually become a better marketer because you can then understand the context. And so one of the fun things I used to do when I was in OpenJaw Technologies was kind of tell them about the history of different advertising structures now and advertising kind of things. And people used to love it. But the earliest ad I could find, and people can argue on this one, so I got no problem with this, it was the ad for the William Caxton Bible around 1473. Now, there was obviously signs outside stores before, which you could argue was advertising right as far back as, Greek and Sumerian days. So if you take, say, that's when the first ad, then the next type of advertising that came was a couple of 100 years later, which was sort of newspaper advertising in a lot more depth and magazine advertising a lot more depth. And then around the kind of mid 1850s was really the dawn of direct marketing through the use of like Sears catalogs and so on. And then radio advertising came later. And ultimately in the late sort of mid to late 40s was television came. And we all know one particular thing, but we kind of forget about the origin of it. And the idea is a soap opera. And a soap opera came from the fact that Procter & Gamble used to sponsor full TV programs. And a kind of nerd alert, trivia alert, stuff that I absolutely adore, is that a gentleman called Pat Weaver, who everybody knows here, but they don't realize they know it, because he's the father of Sigourney Weaver of Aliens and various other incredible movies in the 80s and 90s. His Pat Weaver had come in from Young and Rubicam, and he came into NBC and he looked at what was going on, and what happened was NBC would be selling the whole TV program, hence soap operas, and they would sell the whole program. And his insight was, well, I see if I buy a magazine, they're selling different pages in the magazine. So why don't we kind of sell slots within each section? And of course, NBC didn't want that. And because they're like, well, I've already got this existing thing, which is, I can sell the whole TV program. Eventually, he introduced a program called Today, which is still around, and he was able to go and sell the slots within Today. It's like in a magazine format where you're selling it through it. And then NBC found out that was obviously a lot more lucrative. Now, the ultimate slot at the time was it was quite long, it was like around a minute. And, fast forward a couple of years to the dawn of TV advertising in the UK. And as Paul Feldwick wrote to me on this topic, who's written some incredible books that I really highly recommend you read, Anatomy of Humbug and so on. And he pointed out, he said, well, the original thing was that ITV in the UK could sell 60 minutes because that was the available slot that they could do it and make it work. And then they eventually said, well, actually, we'll narrow it down to 30 seconds because that's actually inventory we can sell. But it so happens that the 30-second and 60-second are also kind of long enough for you to create a sort of story arc in that actually kind of helps people kind of get their head around what the story is and can do it, compared to, say, 5 seconds or, well, arguably 10 seconds that you can do it in 10 seconds as well. And so these kind of ideas of how the 30-second commercial or the 60-second commercial are like carved in stone. No, it's actually just an origin thing from how Pat Weaver thought, and actually how ITV were just slicing up their inventory. So it was just completely coincidental and a little bit of luck, and that's kind of where we are today. And of course, then the whole thing then becomes much more sort of convoluted, 60, 70 years down the track, that this is the be all and end all where we build our careers around that. And yeah, it turns out not to be like that at all. In fact, there's a thing used in John in investment, and it's called alpha. I think the word is where where the alpha is, where the kind of unique, where you can have an edge. It's kind of a sort of a symmetry, if you will. And you could argue that these newer channels like TikTok and what have you, they are examples, or they're examples of asymmetry or arbitrage in action, whereby people think that the 30-second is where the way to go because that's what we believe, but you can get a much lower cost and a much bigger reach by just thinking about the world through the lens of arbitrage. And actually, these new channels are arbitrage in action.
Yeah, it's interesting. And even TikTok, like just talking about legacy, TikTok's, was built on that 60-second sort of video thing where a lot of other social media were using static or text posts. And then TikTok just came in and went, let's create entertaining 60-second clips that people can scroll through. And I'm just like, I was thinking to myself, as I was, doom scrolling on TikTok, trying to figure out how does this thing work? I'm like, this is the new veg out in front of the TV and just sort of like watch ads and programs that just, go through your psyche. People are, that's not effective. I'm like, yeah, but I mean, TV's been doing that for years. So like, it's the same thing.
They mentioned about YouTube being, now I'm plucking numbers out of my brain here, but it's like 40% of YouTube, maybe 50% of YouTube is watched on the big screen. And maybe it was Karen Nelson Field telling me this. And in fact, I was like, hey, nodding my head, and I'm going, hold on a second, that's me, where I'll go onto YouTube and I'll look at some obscure motor race and I'll have it on the screen. And I just anecdotes are not evidence by a long shot. And, one, middle-aged man is not an evidence of the world. But I watch more linear TV than I'd say anybody who's 21. Anybody who's 21, like my nieces and nephews, they wouldn't even know what linear TV was and bit them on the ass. So I just can't kind of work all this out. Where we've got all this evidence around the globe of like people glued to their phones, and you're like, and poor Tom Roach has to write an article going, you can develop brands on digital. I'm like, what are we smoking here?
Okay, with that trip down memory lane and a bit more understanding of the history of where these things come from, where do you think it's going? Like you said, you're working for technology. If you listen to people like Andreessen, software is eating the world. I would say that AI is now eating software. But there are new channels, new people talking about, you should put your money here or there. Like, what will stay the same and what won't?
The things that obviously it's going to stay the same is that human nature hasn't changed, and we'll still be, driven by all sorts of emotions, and I am the example of that, where I will spend far too much of my waking time thinking about things that are completely irrelevant, like motorsport, cars, and careers, and just kind of like it's all ideas in my head. Yeah, it's nothing to do with reality. We're all involved. We're all stuck in our heads the whole time, and we're involved in things that are emotional and so on. So human nature is not going to change. That's about it. But there's a very interesting book by Kevin Kelly, which is behind me here, a few years ago, called The Inevitable. And it's kind of like one of the things I would say to any marketers or advertising types leading to this is that there's a certain set of inevitable things that are going to happen that are kind of inevitable, and us talking about the world through looking through the rearview mirror, which is kind of a lot of the conversation, it doesn't help anybody. And one of the points he talks about, apropos what you just said there, John, which is that AI is inevitable. It's just going to happen. All these conversations around like how it's bad, good, or indifferent, it doesn't matter. Like, it's all irrelevant. It's going to happen. It is happening. In fact, again, one of my other sidebars, another way I can assess you're not the smartest marketing or advertising person in the world is, aside from the fact you say email doesn't work, or any of these other things. If you say AI is not relevant and AI is not coming for me, then I'm like, okay, it's definitely coming for you, or it doesn't work. There's a lot of people going on ChatGPT does all these stupid things, and I'm like, yeah, but you don't understand exponential technologies then, because one of the things I do in one of my classes, I bring up my wife has an original iPhone, like one of the ones from 2008. And when she showed it to me, I was like, that's a load of rubbish. Look at my beautiful BlackBerry Pearl. Look at that. It's got buttons. How do I phone anybody? This thing doesn't work, And I was just like, yeah, Like, fast forward a couple of years later, and I get an iPhone 4, and I'm like, oh my God, look at this thing. It's perfect, blah, blah, blah. Because, I'm an idiot. I didn't kind of tune into the fact that exponential technologies means that the power of a silicon chip is increasing every 18 months at a much lower price parity rate. And once we understand the world through the lens of exponential, where things are going to get dematerialized and demonetized, then you can go and say, it's crap now, but it's going to be amazing later. So me looking at the Tesla in 2009, when it was basically a Lotus Elise with a battery going 90 kilometers at a stretch in terms of distance compared to what's going to happen now. So what's happening is we're looking at the world through this lens of where we came from, or we've got to work at the lens of where we're going to. And like, again, if you're not using ChatGPT and you haven't signed up for the subscription for $20 a month, you're a complete idiot, as we say in Ireland. Like, you're lacking in any form of common sense, because even small things like, I had to do something for a company the other day, and I had brain fade. I was like, oh man, I can't think of it. So I put it into it, and I was like, oh yeah, of course, that thing. That, if I hadn't had it, I would have probably spent 4 hours crying into a metaphorical pint trying to work out what to do. Instead, I got an answer in 30 seconds, went, oh, that's kind of how it is. And in this case, I was actually trying to come up with titles, headlines, and trying to create a course, and I just couldn't crack it. And so essentially, I've got a new brain. And who doesn't want a new brain to help you? But we're only, 15 months into ChatGPT, and this is before all the other ones kind of come through. So this is the equivalent. Anybody who says ChatGPT or AI is stupid is the equivalent of me talking to my wife in 2008 and saying, that Apple iPhone will never catch on because look at my amazing BlackBerry Pearl.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, like ChatGPT is just like having a couple of employees, just like you little lackeys, doing research. Give them any sort of, I call them task lackeys. Just go and do this thing, and bang, it comes back. But it's $20 a month.
That's why I say make friends with a techie person, understand what the technology can do, because that's where the alpha is. I can't really recommend that strong enough, because you have to understand how technology works. Because back to Kevin Kelly, if you don't understand technology works, you can't do the inevitable. I've got to work out how these things work and go through the sort of like the slight kind of pain in the ass of having to work it out. Because once you understand it, you go, right, I can see how things are going to pan out very quickly, because the speed of these windows opening is much faster. In fact, let's use this as an example. We saw the whole crypto hype. The crypto hype went up very fast and down very fast. The whole NFT hype went up very fast and down very fast. And rather than go and say, well, that was all rubbish and people were doing this, it arguably all of those. The better kind of idea is to go and say, actually what's going to happen is things are going to be adopted super fast through the use of memes. In fact, I'll go even further. Rather than being cynical about NFTs and crypto, a good marketer will go and say, what actually happened here? And what they did was use social media, memes, ideas, and thoughts to create hype, to, obviously pump up valuation of something that arguably doesn't need that valuation. But it's kind of happening actually outside of crypto. People are using this idea elsewhere. And hence ChatGPT goes from nothing to using one channel, which is PR, digital PR, and Sam Altman. And that's it. That's it. It becomes the biggest brand in the world. That's it. Everybody knows it. Everywhere in the world.
It's crazy, isn't it? No TV ad. On that note, you have mentioned a couple of books throughout our discussion now. Are there any that you're reading now or have read that you'd definitely recommend people read?
Well, I have a couple of ones. So we did talk about the history of advertising and what have you. As you can see from behind here, I actually do recommend people buy actual physical books. I also have a Kindle, but I use the Kindle for traveling. You need the real physical book, and you should go over these physical books. And anybody who's a person worth their salt in marketing has to have at least Ogilvy in advertising or positioning by recent trend. You've got to look at the original kind of stuff. When it comes to actually being a marketer and operating in the world, regardless of your kind of where you are in the totem pole or hierarchy, the books that I found most interesting, and some of them are 15, 20 years old, was anything by Jeffrey Pfeffer, who is a Harvard professor. He's written a book called Hard Facts, Dangerous Half-Truth, and Total Nonsense. And part of the reason why I really liked reading that originally back in the day was that all these things that I was led to believe, for instance, one where you whack off the bottom 10% of the staff every year and the data says you shouldn't do that. Yeah, because it basically says it's the worst thing in the world. He also has a book called Power, which is really every mistake you make as a senior person is in that book. And tied in with that is Phil Rosenweg's Halo effect, which is really makes sure that you don't go and buy into anything, including me and what I say. You go and say, well, why am I doing this? Because it's a halo effect. I also think you should have a look at the Inevitable Kevin Kelly, which I think is very useful. There's a whole host of stuff, but there are ones off the top of my head. I think you should read the classics. Back in the day stuff like scientific advertising stuff. I highly recommend everybody here reads stuff around direct response. David Ogilvy is a big fan of that. I love direct response advertising. Having invested my own money and run my own firms, you very quickly start loving direct response. Yeah. So anybody who works in marketing advertising has to understand direct response. I'm a hack as a copywriter. I'm not one of these people who can do incredible copywriting, but you should be able to copyright because you can't go and work out what's going on unless you understand copywriting. So any good copywriting book, I have a few here.
Yeah. Actually, I've got Anne Hadley's Everybody Writes here. There's one that Vicky Ross recommended. It's on my desk, actually, right next to me. I haven't read it yet, but I'll get around to it. But I think also just practicing copywriting, absorbing other people's good writing. I think just vicariously sort of trains your brain, and then you sort of pick up phrases, and then you sort of meld it into your own style. Yeah. It's very interesting.
Well, it's true. There's another thing in copywriting, which, as I said to you earlier on, one of the things that people come to me is on coaching. And I'm sure, in my mind, it's because they come to me because of my incredible good looks and charm. But in reality, they've got a problem to solve. And a lot of the problems they want to solve as a marketing person is they're not getting through internally. And it's typically a combination of they don't have the right words and they're not persuasive. I mean, these are the killer apps for a marketing director is to be very persuasive and be able to use the right language and just ultimately understand persuasion. Why you obviously should be reading Robert Cialdini's Psychology of Influence and all the behavioral science stuff. Don't care what people say. People say, "Oh, behavioral science, good, bad, doesn't matter." Go read all the stuff and make your own mind up and read Rory Sutherland's books and really tune into this idea. But the bit that the combination of being able to write and use language and copywriting, it all kind of melds together because that then makes you more persuasive. And we all know that the people who reach the top of their career are ultimately persuaders. They're ultimately, as Vance Parker's books, they're ultimately hidden persuaders. And it's as you get higher in your career, your capabilities less matter than your ability to persuade.
And yes, on that note, I always say, some people say, "Oh, we did this, and then now we're going to invest in marketing and sales." I'm like, no, you should always be marketing and always be selling, constantly, never stop throughout your career. And I think the same is true for your career.
People who run their own businesses know that. But it's tricky, family-run businesses. The bad company I was talking about earlier, they're like, "Colin, we now need to do marketing and sales because we've just invested in this factory." And I'm like, "Oh, okay, well, that's fine. It's fine. It's just about where companies are in their stage of development. Now, in this case, they're 40 years in, and they're kind of going, maybe I need some marketing and sales. So it is what it is."
Over to you now. Like, tell us about a bit more about you. What are you selling? Speaking about selling, if someone went, oh, I'm listening to this, Colin sounds like a good guy. What do you actually offer people?
Well, I do three things. If you're working in a startup and you want to know how to position and go to market, that's what people come to me for. A lot of people come to me for coaching advice on how to become a variation of better marketer. That's a lot. Like we're talking like double figures over the last 18 months or so. I work with brands on their sort of digital commerce, and ultimately that bleeds over into marketing effectiveness discussions, distribution discussions, and what have you. And also retailers to help them set up their retail media networks. I'm currently working with retailers in Australia, New Zealand, Turkey, UK, maybe hopefully in Ireland as well, on how to set up a retail media network. I do that in tandem with other people because it's very technical and quite hard to do. And the other thing I do is a lot of writing, like a lot of writing. And some people come to me to write best practice stuff. So I've done a lot of work for Work and obviously Marketing Week as a columnist and so on. And back to the writing. I highly recommend you learn how to write, because through writing is how you learn how to think. And if you came to me 15 years ago and said, Colin, you would be writing, well, as I have done in the last 2 years, maybe 300,000 words, I would have laughed at you. But that's actually how I kind of vaguely have some well-formed ideas. It's because I can write.
Yeah, and sometimes the process of writing I find is like better than, regardless of how good the writing actually is at the end, is like the process is the learning opportunity. Sometimes like organizing thoughts, putting them into a page, into a structure, like that in itself is so critical. Speaking of that,
Yeah,
what about
and you hear people talk about that, John. By the way, you hear people talk about that, going, "Oh no, I need to get my ideas down by writing," and I used to laugh at that. I'm like, no, that it turns out that is the only way to do it, and that's why I admire the work that you've done, for better or for worse, writing all that stuff around brand building, because it forced you to create these cohesive list of ideas and make them work. It's very very hard to do, like really hard to do.
yeah, structure it all? Yeah, no, thanks. And speaking of that, if someone wants to get in contact with you, preferred method, I'm guessing it's not Google Docs.
Yeah, nothing like that. You get in touch with me on LinkedIn. It's actually quite easy to find me. Just find me on Colin Lewis, or you can find me on Twitter, Colin A Lewis. That's my middle initial, so Colin Lewis with an A. Or you can just email me. I'm all for emails. Colin A Lewis at gmail.com is my personal address, so I always look at that. Colin A Lewis at gmail.com. But if I'm being smartass, I'll go and say you can phone me on 1-800-Colin for you, but nobody ever phones me on that.
Or maybe visit your MySpace page or something, or Tumblr blog. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly, yeah. My Bebo page, my MySpace page, yeah, exactly.
Okay, thanks very much for being on the show. Really appreciate it, Colin. And well, I'm sure we'll talk soon anyway, but thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thank you for your time, John. Thanks very much for inviting me on the show.